Well, I've got no use for the women. A true one may never be found. They'll use a man for his money. When it's gone, they'll turn him down. They're all alike at the bottom, selfish and grasping for
The kitchen
all.
in the now abandoned farmhouse
They'll
of
stick
John
by a
Wright,
man while
a
he's
gloomy kitchen, and left without having ever been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, and other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, the outer door opens and the sheriff comes in, followed by the county attorney and Hale. The sheriff and Hale are men in middle life. The county attorney is a young man. All are bundled up and go at once to the stove. They are followed by the two women, the sheriff wife first, and then Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale is disturbed now and looks fearfully about as she enters. The women have come in slowly and stand close together near the door.
This feels good. Come up to the fire, ladies.
I'm not cold.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
Well, by the way, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them yesterday?
It's just the same. When it dropped up below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on, but I told him not to touch anything except the stove. And you know Frank.
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Yesterday. When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy, I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over here everything myself.
Well, Mr. Hale, tell just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Kerry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. And we came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway. And all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe if I went into the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Well, let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house.
I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock, so I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, "Come in." I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door, indicating this door, and there in that rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
They all look at the rocker.
What was she doing?
She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked queer.
How do you mean, queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up.
How did she seem to feel about your coming?
Why, I don't think she minded one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, "How do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it?" And she said, "Is it?" And went on kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, "I want to see John." And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, "Can't I see John?" "No," she says, kind of dull-like. "Ain't he home?" says I. "Yes," says she. "He's home." Then why can't I see him? I asked her out of patience. Because he's dead, says she. Dead? Says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but just rocking back and forth. Why? Where is he? Says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs, like that. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here, then I says, why, what did he die of? He died of a rope around his neck, says she, and just went on pleating at her apron. When I went out and called Henry, I thought I might need help. We went upstairs, and there he was, lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs, where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked. But Harry, he went up to him and he said, no, he's dead all right, and we better not touch anything. So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting that same way. Has anybody been notified, I asked? No, she says, unconcerned. Who did this, Mrs. Wright? Said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating of her apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know? Says Harry. No, says she. Weren't you sleeping in the bed with him? Says Harry. Yes, says she. But I was on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope round his neck and strangled him. And you didn't wake up? Says Harry. I didn't wake up, said she after him. We must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, for after a minute she said, I sleep sound. Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell the story first to the coroner or the sheriff, so Harry went fast as he could to River's place, where there's a telephone.
And what did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner?
She moved from that chair to this one over here, and just sat there with her hands held together and looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I had come in to see if John wanted to put in a telephone. And at that, she started to laugh, and then she stopped and looked at me, scared. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and you, Mr. Peters, and so I guess that's all I know that you don't.
I guess we'll go upstairs first and then out to the barn and around there. You're convinced that there was nothing important here, nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf, then pulls his hand away, sticky.
Here's a nice mess.
The women draw nearer.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. She was worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break.
Well, you can't beat the women. Held for murder and worrying about her preserves.
Well, I guess before we're through, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
The two women move a little closer together.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
The women do not unbend. He goes to the sink, takes a dipper full of water from the pail, and pouring it into a basin, washes his hands. He starts to wipe them on the roller towel, and then turns it for a cleaner place.
Dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
To be sure. And yet, I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too.
Well, I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
Well, I liked her well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson, and then
Yes.
it never seemed a very cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had either.
You mean that they didn't get on very well?
No, I don't mean anything. But I don't think a place would be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was to take in some clothes for her, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The women listen to the men's steps on the stairs, then look about the kitchen.
I hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
She arranges the pans under the sink, which the lawyer had shoved out of place.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that come out to make the fire might have got a little of this on. I thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she'd come away in such a hurry.
Mrs. Peters has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room and lifted one end of a towel that covers a pan.
She had bread set.
Mrs. Hale's eyes are fixed on a loaf of bread beside the bread box, which is on a low shelf at the other side of the room. She moves slowly towards it.
She was going to put this in there.
She picks up a loaf, then abruptly drops it.
It's a shame about a fruit. I wonder if it's all gone. I think there's some that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Ah, yes, here. Oh, this is cherries too. I declare, I believe that's the only one. Oh, she's gonna feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put my cherries up last summer.
She puts the little bottle on the kitchen table, center of the room. With a sigh, she's about to sit down in the rocking chair. Before she is seated, she realizes what chair it is. With a slow look at it, she steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet.
She goes to the door at the right, but after looking into the other room, she steps back.
You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them.
They go in the other room and then reappear. Mrs. Peters is carrying a dress and a skirt. Mrs. Hale's following with a pair of shoes.
Oh, my, it's cold in there.
She puts the clothes on the big table and hurries to the stove.
Ooh. Right was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Miss Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was taking?
She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said they was in the top drawer in the cupboard. Oh, yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door. Oh, yes, here it is.
She quickly shuts the door leading upstairs.
Mrs. Peters.
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
Do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did.
Hmm.
Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in a speech, and he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake when they were slipping that rope under his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He said that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out that was what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
She puts her hand in the dish towel which lies on the table, then stands looking down at the table, one half of which is clean, the other messy.
It's wiped up to here.
She makes moves as to finish the work, then turns and looks at a loaf of bread outside the bread box and drops the towel.
I wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. It seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
I suppose it is. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Mrs. Peters takes off her fur tippet, goes to hang it on the hook at the back of the room, and stands looking at the under part of the small corner table.
Oh, she was piecing a quilt.
She brings the large sewing basket, and they look at the bright pieces.
The log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she's going to quilt it or knot it.
Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and the county attorney.
Oh, they wonder if she was going to quilt it or knot it.
Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
Well, I don't know if there's anything so strange, our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get to the evidence. I don't see it as anything to laugh about.
Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on. Look at that sewing. All the rest of it, it's been so nice and even, and look at this, it's all over the place. Why? It looks as if she didn't know what she was about.
After she has said this, they look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good. Bad sewing always makes me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish it to this end. Mrs. Peters.
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
What do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired. Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and some string.
In that cupboard, maybe.
Oh, why, here's a bird cage. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
What? I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know if she took one. And maybe she did. Oh, she used to sing real pretty herself.
It seems funny to think of a bird in here. Oh, but she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? Oh, I wonder what happened to it.
I suppose maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling that some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart.
Looks as if someone must have been rough with it.
Oh, why, yes.
Well, I wish if they were going to find any evidence, they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
Oh, but I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you, I do wish, Mrs. Peters, I wish I'd come over sometimes when she was here. I just wish I had.
Oh, but of course you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children?
I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see a road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place, and it always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster. Sometimes I can see it now.
Well, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Somehow we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house and Wright out to work all day and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink, and he kept his word as well as most, I guess. He paid his debts. But he was a hard man. Hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him. Oh, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. I should think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose went with it?
I don't know. Unless it got sick and died.
She reaches over and swings the broken door, swings it again. Both women watch.
You weren't raised around here, were you? You didn't know her.
Not till they brought her yesterday.
You come to think of it, she was like a bird herself. Real pretty and sweet. Kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind.
Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. Oh, there couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are in here and her things.
They look in the sewing basket.
Oh, here's some red. I expect this has got sewing things in it. Oh, what pretty box. Looks like it's something that somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here.
She opens the box and suddenly puts her hand to her nose.
Oh, what?
Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away.
There's something wrapped in this fabric of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Oh, Mrs. Peters,
Mrs. Peters bends closer.
It's the bird.
But Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck, look at its neck. It's all other to the side.
Somebody wrung its neck.
Their eyes meet, a look of growing comprehension and of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips the box under the quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Enter the sheriff and the county attorney. Mrs. Peters rises.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting. I'm sure. Has the bird flown?
We think the cat got it.
Is there a cat?
Mrs. Hale glances in a quick, covert way at Mrs. Peters.
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
No sign at all of anyone having come from the outside. Their own rope. Let's go up again and go over it piece by piece. It would have to have been someone who knew just the...
Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there, not looking at one another, as if peering into something and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it is in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they cannot help saying it.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around it. No. Bright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing, and he killed that too.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
There was an awful thing was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope round his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
Her hand goes out and rests on the birdcage.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there'd been years and years of nothing, and then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful. Still, after the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota, and my first baby died after he was 2 years old, and me with no other then.
How soon do you suppose they'll be through, looking for the evidence?
I know what stillness is.
I wish...
The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood there in the choir and sang. Ooh, I wish I could... I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together. We live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. If I was you, I wouldn't tell her the fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
Mrs. Peters takes the bottle, looks about for something to wrap it in, then takes the petticoat from the clothes brought from the other room and very nervously begins winding this around the bottle.
My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh? Getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary. As if that could have had anything to do with... Wouldn't they laugh?
The men are heard coming downstairs.
Maybe they would, and maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with this strange way of doing it.
The women's eyes meet for an instant. Enter Hale from the outer door.
Well, I've got my team around. Pretty cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
You want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law. I just want you to come here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
Windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
Hale goes outside. The sheriff follows the county attorney into the other room. Then Mrs. Hale rises, hands tight together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale's. After a moment, Mrs. Hale holds her eyes. Then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back the quilt pieces and tries to push the box in the bag. It is too big. She opens the box, starts to take a bird out, but cannot touch it and goes to pieces, standing there helpless. The sound of a knob turning in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. Enter the county attorney and the sheriff.
Well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies?
We call it not it, Mr. Henderson.
And laughed in his face at his fall. My pal was a straight young puncher, honest and upright and square. But he turned to a gunman and gambler, and a woman sent him there. Quicker and surer were his gunplay, till his heart and his body lay dead. When a vaquero insulted her picture, he filled in full of lead. All night long they trailed him through Mesquite and Chaparral, and I couldn't but think of the woman as I saw him pitch and fall.